Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. You know the drill. We take a complex topic, dig into the key sources, and try to pull out the insights that matter for you.
That's right.
And today, we are diving deep, really deep, into a book that fundamentally changed how we think about, well, thinking itself. It's Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow.
A modern classic. Kahneman, an Israeli-American psychologist, actually won the Nobel Prize in economics back in 2002, which is pretty amazing for a psychologist. Right?
Totally. Shows the impact. His work, especially with his longtime collaborator, Amos Tversky, was a real challenge to those older economic models.
Yeah, the ones that assumed we're all perfectly rational decision makers, like little calculators in our heads. Kahneman and Tversky showed, now, it's a lot messier than that.
Messier, but maybe more interesting. And that's our mission today. Unpacking the insights from thinking fast and slow, understanding these two ways we think, and the mental shortcuts and traps that come with them.
And it's a book that really bridged the gap. Academic rigor, but written in a way that, millions of people could pick it up and get something practical out of it. Translated into over 40 languages, sold millions. Its reach is just huge.
So where did it all begin? This partnership between Kahneman and Tversky seems crucial.
It really was. They started working together back in the 70s at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. They were both fascinated by intuitive judgment, how we make snap decisions, and especially how we often get things systematically wrong.
Systematic errors.
Yeah.
Not just random mistakes.
Exactly. That led to their landmark 1974 paper in Science, Judgment Under Uncertainty, Heuristics and Biases. This introduced the idea of heuristics, those mental shortcuts we use. Super useful, mostly, but they also lead to predictable biases. That paper, cited, over 60,000 times now? Massive influence.
Wow. And they didn't stop there. They took on economics again.
They did. In 1979, they published prospect theory in Econometrica. This was a direct alternative to the standard expected utility theory. It described how people actually make decisions under risk, considering gains and losses, not just final outcomes. It was revolutionary for economics.
Okay, so let's get into the core idea that Kahneman is maybe most famous for from this book, the two systems of thought.
Right, System 1 and System 2. Now, Kahneman himself stresses this is a simplified model, a metaphor almost, not like two separate parts physically in the brain. But it's an incredibly useful way to think about our mental processes. The terms themselves actually came from Stanovich and West earlier, but Kahneman really popularized them.
Okay, so System 1, the fast one.
Exactly. System 1 is the star of the show most of the time. It's fast, automatic, intuitive, effortless, and often emotional. It operates constantly behind the scenes, generating impressions, feelings, intuitions.
Like your gut reaction.
Pretty much. It relies heavily on association, memory, past experiences. It develops these mental shortcuts to deal with the world quickly. Think of it as your brain's autopilot.
Efficient, but maybe error-prone.
That's the trade-off. It prioritizes speed and low effort over absolute accuracy. It's great for recognizing threats quickly or making routine decisions. Neurologically, some studies link it to older brain regions like the basal ganglia and amygdala. Its evolutionary purpose seems clear. Quick responses.
Can you give us some concrete examples? When is System 1 running the show?
Oh, all the time. Recognizing someone's angry face instantly, turning towards a sudden loud noise, driving on an empty road when you're experienced, completing a common phrase like bread and...
butter.
Exactly. Or knowing 2 + 2 = 4 without thinking. It just happens effortlessly.
Oh, it makes sense. So if that's the autopilot, what's System 2, the slow one?
Right. System 2 is the conscious, reasoning self. It's slow, deliberate, analytical, logical, and requires effort and attention. This is the system you engage when you need to focus, solve a complex problem, or override an initial impulse from System 1.
So this is the one doing the heavy lifting, mentally speaking.
Definitely. It's associated with the subjective feeling of concentration, choice, agency. It performs complex calculations, follows rules, compares options, makes deliberate choices. But it requires significant mental energy. Cognitive resources are limited.
So it's lazy.
Kahneman actually uses that word. System 2 is inherently lazy. It takes effort to engage it, and our brains tend to conserve energy. So often it just accepts the suggestions from System 1 without much scrutiny. It also operates sequentially, one step at a time, and it's easily disrupted if your attention wanders.
And neuroscientists link this one more to the prefrontal cortex, the newer parts of the brain.
Generally, yes. Areas involved in planning, working memory, self-control. Some argue it's more uniquely human, tied to language and abstract thought.
What are some typical System 2 tasks?
Okay, think about parking in a tight space. calculating 17 times 24, filling out your tax return, trying to find a specific person in a dense crowd, learning a new skill like driving for the first time, anything that makes you consciously focus and think things through step by step.
So we have this fast, intuitive system 1 and this slow, effortful system 2. How do they actually work together day to day?
It's a constant interplay. System 1 runs automatically and continuously generates suggestions for System 2, impressions, intuitions, intentions, feelings.
Suggestions.
Yeah, and most of the time, System 2 just endorses these suggestions with little or no modification. Kahneman calls this lazy endorsement. Your intuition feels right, so you go with it.
But System 2 can step in.
Oh, absolutely. It's supposed to be the monitor. When System 1 runs into difficulty, maybe it detects something unexpected, a conflict, or an error, it calls for help from System 2. System 2 then directs attention, analyzes the problem more carefully, and can override System 1's initial response.
So when things get tricky, the manual pilot takes over from the autopilot.
That's the metaphor Kahneman uses, exactly. System 1 is the autopilot, handling routine flights smoothly. System 2 is the manual pilot, engaged for takeoff, landing, turbulence, or navigating complex situations. The brain even seems to have mechanisms, like in the anterior cingulate cortex, that detect these cognitive conflicts and signal the need for more System 2 involvement.
Okay, this interplay is fascinating. And it seems like those heuristics and biases you mentioned earlier fit right in here, particularly with System 1's shortcuts.
Precisely. Heuristics are basically System 1's way of simplifying complex questions. Instead of doing a full System 2 analysis, which takes time and energy, System 1 substitutes an easier question. It's efficient, but it's also the source of many predictable cognitive biases.
Let's unpack some of the big ones. Where should we start? Availability.
Good place to start. The availability heuristic. This is where we judge the frequency or probability of an event based on how easily examples come to mind.
So if I can think of it easily, it must be common.
That's the shortcut, yeah. Think about news coverage. After seeing lots of stories about, say, shark attacks, you might overestimate the actual risk because those vivid examples are readily available in your memory. It's not just the number of examples, but the ease of retrieval that matters. Something dramatic or recent comes to mind easily and inflates our judgment.
Makes sense. I guess I do that. What's next? Representativeness.
Right, the representativeness heuristic. Here, we judge the probability that something belongs to a category based on how much it resembles or is representative of our stereotype of that category.
Like judging a book by its cover.
Kind of, yeah. But we often ignore crucial statistical information, the base rates. Kahneman and Tversky's classic example involved describing a shy, detail-oriented person and asking if he was more likely a librarian or a farmer. People overwhelmingly chose librarians, fitting the stereotype, even though there are far more farmers than librarians in the population.
So we focus on the description, matching the stereotype, and ignore the actual odds.
Exactly. This heuristic leads to things like ignoring sample size or the conjunction fallacy, thinking specific conditions are more probable than a single general one just because they seem more representative.
Okay, availability, representativeness.
Yeah.
What about anchoring? That sounds like it involved getting stuck.
It does, the anchoring and adjustment heuristic. Our estimates are often heavily influenced by the first piece of information we receive the anchor, even if that anchor is completely arbitrary.
Arbitrary? How so?
In one famous experiment, people were asked if the percentage of African nations in the UN was higher or lower than a random number spun on a wheel of fortune. Then they estimated the actual percentage. Their final estimate was heavily skewed towards that initial random number.
Wow. So even a totally irrelevant number can pull our judgment.
Yes. We anchor on that initial value and then adjust away from it, but usually insufficiently. You see this all the time in negotiations. The first offer sets an anchor that influences the whole process.
These heuristics really highlight how System 1 can lead us astray. What about the specific biases that result? The framing effect sounds important.
Hugely important. The framing effect shows that how information is presented or framed can drastically alter our choices, even if the underlying facts are identical.
Like the glass half full or half empty idea.
Exactly, but with real consequences. The classic example is the Asian disease problem. People were asked to choose between programs to combat a disease expected to kill 600 people. When options were framed in terms of lives saved, for example, Program A saves 200 people, people were risk-averse. But when the exact same options were framed in terms of lives lost, or example, program C means 400 people will die, people suddenly became risk-seeking to avoid the certain loss.
Same outcome, different choices just based on wording? That's powerful.
It really is. And it connects to another huge one, loss aversion.
We hate losing more than we like winning.
Pretty much sums it up. Kahneman and Tversky found that losses loom about twice as large psychologically as equivalent gains. Losing $100 feels roughly twice as bad as gaining $100 feels good.
Explains why we might hold on to losing stocks too long, maybe.
Definitely one application. It makes us reluctant to accept losses. It also explains why we often demand much more compensation to give something up than we'd be willing to pay to acquire it in the first place, which leads directly to...
endowment effect.
You got it, the endowment effect. We tend to overvalue things simply because we own them. The classic experiment involved coffee mugs. People given a mug demanded significantly more money to sell it than people without a mug were willing to pay to buy one. Just owning it endowed it with extra value in their eyes, probably linked to loss aversion. Giving it up feels like a loss.
Okay, what else is in this gallery of biases? Confirmation bias must be a big one.
Oh, it's huge and pervasive. Confirmation bias is our tendency to seek out, interpret, and favor information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs, while ignoring or downplaying information that contradicts them.
We like being right, so we look for proof we are right.
Basically, yes. We're not very good at actively seeking out evidence that could prove us wrong, even though that's often more informative. It makes changing our minds really difficult.
And the sunk cost fallacy. Sounds like throwing good money after bad.
That's exactly what the sunk cost fallacy is. It's continuing to invest time, money, or effort into something that's clearly failing simply because we've already invested so much. The past investment, the sunk cost, shouldn't logically influence future decisions, but emotionally, it's hard to let go and waste that previous investment. Think finishing a terrible movie just because you've already watched an hour.
Guilty as charged. Okay, couple more quick ones. Overconfidence.
Always a popular one, overconfidence bias. We systematically overestimate our own abilities, knowledge, and the precision of our beliefs. Most people think they're better than average drivers, for example.
Which is statistically impossible.
Right. And then there's hindsight bias, the I knew it all along effect. After an event occurs, we tend to believe we could have predicted it much more easily than was actually the case. It makes past events seem obvious and inevitable.
Okay, last one for now. Status quo bias.
Status quo bias, a preference for keeping things the way they are. We often perceive any change from the current state as a potential loss, linking back to loss aversion. This is why default options are so powerful. Sticking with the default requires no action and avoids the perceived risk of change.
So this whole collection, it's not just random errors, it's predictable patterns.
That's the crucial point. These aren't just slips. They are systematic ways our thinking deviates from pure logic or rationality. And as Kahneman found, just knowing about these biases doesn't automatically make you immune to them. Awareness is just the first step.
Which brings us back to prospect theory. How does that fit into this picture of biases in decision-making?
Prospect theory is the formal model Kahneman and Tversky developed to describe how people actually make choices involving risk and uncertainty, incorporating many of these biases. It was the work that won the Nobel. It contrasts sharply with expected utility theory.
So what are its key ingredients?
Okay, 4 main concepts. First, reference points. We don't evaluate outcomes based on our total wealth, but as gains or losses relative to a specific reference point, usually our current situation, the status quo. A $100 gain feels different if your reference point is being broke versus being a millionaire.
So it's all relative.
Exactly. Second, the asymmetric value function. This captures loss aversion. The function is S-shaped. It's concave for gains, meaning we're generally risk-averse when it comes to gains. We prefer a sure gain over a gamble with equal expected value. But it's convex for losses, meaning we become risk-seeking when facing losses. We'd rather gamble to avoid a sure loss. And critically, the slope is steeper for losses than for gains. That's loss aversion graphically.
Well, steeper for losses.
Yeah.
Got it. What else?
Third, nonlinear probability weighting. We don't treat probabilities objectively. We tend to overweight small probabilities, which explains why we buy lottery tickets. Tiny chance of huge gain, or insurance, tiny chance of huge loss. And we underweight moderate and large probabilities.
So our internal probability calculator is a bit wonky.
You could say that. And fourth, isolation or editing. When faced with complex choices, we simplify them by focusing on the differences between options and often ignoring shared components. This editing phase can lead to different choices depending on how we mentally frame or isolate parts of the problem.
So prospect theory paints a picture where decisions depend on where we start from, how much we hate losing, how we misjudge odds, and how we frame the problem.
That's a great summary. It explains why we might take a safe gain but gamble to avoid a loss. It has huge implications, especially in finance, explaining things like why investors hold losers too long and sell winners too soon, but also in politics, medicine, everywhere people make decisions under uncertainty.
Fascinating. Now, later in the book, Kahneman introduces another duality. The two selves. What's that about?
Right, the experiencing self versus the remembering self. This distinction is about happiness and well-being.
Two different ways to be happy.
Or rather, two different ways we assess our lives. The experiencing self is the one living in the present moment. It's the stream of consciousness, feeling pleasure or pain from second to second. Think, how do you feel right now? Its life is a series of moments.
And the remembering self.
The remembering self is the storyteller. It's the one that looks back, evaluates past experiences, maintains the narrative of our lives, and makes decisions for the future. Think, overall, how was your vacation?
They don't always agree.
That's the crucial insight. The remembering self doesn't just sum up the experiences of the experiencing self. It's heavily biased by two things. The peak end rule, it cares most about the most intense moment and the very end of an experience, and duration neglect. It pays surprisingly little attention to how long the experience lasted.
So a long, mildly pleasant vacation might be remembered less fondly than a short one with one amazing moment and a good ending.
Exactly. Kahneman's famous cold water experiment showed this. People preferred a longer period of discomfort if it ended with slightly less pain, even though the total amount of pain experienced was greater. The remembering self preferred the trial with the better ending, even at the cost of the experiencing self's suffering.
Wow. So the self that makes our decisions, the remembering self, might not always choose what makes our moment-to-moment life, the experiencing self, happiest.
Precisely. This disconnect has huge implications. Think about life satisfaction versus daily mood. You might have high life satisfaction, remembering self, but experience a lot of stress day to day, experiencing self. Or you might choose a high-paying but stressful job, appealing to the remembering self's narrative, over a more enjoyable but less prestigious one. We make decisions based on memories, which are often flawed representations of our actual experiences.
That really makes you think about what happiness even means.
Yeah.
So, considering all these ideas, the two systems, biases, prospect theory, the two selves, what are the practical applications? Where has this work had the biggest impact?
Oh, the impact is incredibly broad. In economics and finance, it basically launched the whole field of behavioral economics. Think Richard Thaler, another Nobel winner. Behavioral finance uses these ideas, loss aversion, overconfidence, to explain stock market anomalies. Things like mental accounting and designing better pension plans, like Save More Tomorrow, come directly from this thinking.
Okay, so economics is transformed. What about business?
Big time. In marketing, understanding anchoring helps set prices. Framing is used constantly in advertising. Choice architecture, designing how options are presented, uses defaults and biases to nudge consumer behavior. Even designing customer service experiences often uses the peak end rule.
Nudging. That sounds like public policy, too.
Absolutely. Public policy has been heavily influenced. Thaler and Sunstein's book Nudge brought these ideas to government. Using defaults for organ donation or retirement savings has dramatically increased participation. Communicating risks more effectively, designing better tax systems. Behavioral insights teams are now common in governments worldwide.
And medicine.
Yes, medicine and health, too. Understanding framing helps doctors communicate treatment risks and benefits more effectively. Loss aversion can be used in programs to improve medication adherence. Even improving the patient experience during unpleasant procedures, like colonoscopies, by applying the peak end rule.
It seems almost universal, even in our personal lives.
Definitely. For personal life, just being aware of these biases can help us make more conscious decisions. Maybe use debiasing techniques. Understanding the two selves might help us manage our well-being better. Maybe spend money in ways that bring more experiential happiness. It can even help us understand interpersonal dynamics and stereotypes better.
It sounds incredibly powerful. But like any major theory, it must have faced some criticisms, right?
Oh, for sure. No theory is perfect. There have been methodological criticisms. Some question how well findings from lab experiments generalize to the real world. Researchers like Gerd Gigerenzer argue that heuristics might actually be very rational and effective in specific environments, ecological rationality. There have also been some issues with replicating certain classic effects, part of the broader replication crisis in psychology. And the reliance on weird samples, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, is always a concern for universality.
Okay. Methodological issues. What about conceptually?
Conceptual criticisms include the idea that the System 1, System 2 dichotomy might be an oversimplification of complex cognitive processes. Others feel it focuses too much on the errors or deviations from rationality, perhaps underestimating how effective these shortcuts often are. Some also argue it's more descriptive how we do think than normative, how we should think.
And ethical concerns. Using this knowledge.
Yes, that's a big one under application in ethics. If we know people's biases, can that knowledge be used to manipulate them? Concerns about paternalism arise with nudging, even if it's libertarian paternalism, who decides what's best. And sometimes focusing on simple behavioral nudges might distract from addressing deeper structural problems.
So important caveats to keep in mind. Despite those criticisms, though, the influence seems undeniable.
Absolutely undeniable. Its influence on culture and contemporary thought is huge. You see it reflected in popular books like Nudge, Predictably Irrational, Misbehaving, and Michael Lewis's book about Kahneman and Tversky, The Undoing Project.
And beyond books.
It's influenced technology and design, especially user experience design, making interfaces more intuitive by anticipating user shortcuts and biases. Tech companies certainly pay attention to this. And in education, these concepts are now standard parts of curricula in psychology, economics, business, and decision science programs.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the core takeaway you think listeners should hold on to from Thinking Fast and Slow?
I think the biggest takeaway is that Kahneman gives us a powerful framework, a language really, to understand the quirks and patterns of our own minds. Knowing about System 1 and System 2, about the common heuristics and biases, doesn't make us perfectly rational overnight. But it gives us the chance to pause, to question our intuitions, especially when the stakes are high.
So awareness is the key.
Awareness is the starting point. It allows us to recognize situations where our fast, intuitive thinking might lead us astray, and to consciously engage our slower, more analytical System 2 when needed. It's about improving our judgment, not eliminating intuition altogether.
A more realistic, more nuanced view of human decision-making.
Exactly. Kahneman's legacy isn't about saying humans are irrational, it's about exploring the complexities and limits of our rationality. It shows how psychology, context, and emotion are integral to how we choose. And by understanding ourselves better, well, maybe we can design better systems, better environments, better ways to help both our experiencing and remembering selves flourish.
A fantastic point. So perhaps the final thought for you, our listeners, is this. Knowing how easily our thinking can be shaped by these hidden forces, how might you approach your next important decision differently? Something to reflect on. That's all for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.